which weapon was never supposed to leave the vault. That much Kara understood the moment she saw it. A blade of crystallized sound, humming with frequencies that made her back teeth ache and her vision blur at the edges, resting in the hands of a man who clearly had no idea what he was holding. He was looking at it the way children look at fire, fascinated, a little afraid, completely unaware that the world had just tilted on its axis around him. She would remember this moment for the rest of her life, and she would spend years trying to explain to people who weren't there why it didn't feel like an accident. It felt, impossibly, like a rival. But that was later. Before any of that could happen, she had to survive the next 4 minutes. The Vekthari hunting party had found her 3 hours ago in the ruins of what had once been a transit station on the edge of Zirion 7's northern shelf. She had been hiding under 6 meters of collapsed ferrocrete, breathing through a filtration tube the width of her thumb, listening to their boots crunch overhead, and hoping the signal dampener she'd shoved against her sternum was doing its job. It wasn't doing a perfect job. She could feel their scanner pulses tickling through the stone like fingers searching for a heartbeat. She was Servovari, a diplomat, a record keeper, a keeper of clan histories, and she was very, very far from home, and the people looking for her wanted the histories she carried in her memory to die with her. She had been a clan archivist for 11 years. She had memorized 17,000 lines of genetic lineage. She had attended 32 treaty negotiations and survived all of them through careful neutrality and impeccable manners. None of that training covered being hunted through ruins by soldiers who had been paid to ensure certain inconvenient truths never reached the Council of Voices. The footsteps stopped directly above her. She closed her eyes and pressed herself smaller into the dark, and she thought, very clearly, this is how it ends for me. Not in ceremony, not with the formal words spoken over my namestone, here, in the dark, under rubble, alone. Then she heard a different sound, one that didn't belong. Something metallic and rhythmic, clattering down the far side of the ruined structure. A distraction. A clumsy, obvious, thoroughly human distraction, made by someone who apparently had no idea how to move silently, but understood, on some instinctive level, that noise could be redirected like water. The hunting party moved toward it. The weight above her shifted, and a pair of hands, large, five-fingered, distinctly not Vekthari, reached through a gap in the rubble and grabbed her arm. She almost screamed. She didn't. She went. His name was Wade, and he told her this approximately 12 seconds after pulling her out of the rubble, whispering it like it was the most natural thing in the world to introduce yourself to a terrified alien woman you just hauled out of a collapsed building on a planet you weren't technically authorized to be on. Wade Calloway, he said, and held out his hand, and she stared at it, because Servovari do not press flesh with strangers, and he must have read something in her stillness, because he pulled his hand back and said, "Right, sorry. Let's move first, names later." And then he moved, quick and low and surprisingly quiet, now that he wasn't deliberately making noise, and she followed him because what else was there to do? And that was how it began. Kara had been stationed on Zirion 7 as part of a cultural liaison mission from the Servovari Concordat, her people's governing body, an ancient institution devoted to the maintenance of records, treaties, and the long, careful memory that held interspecies civilization together. The Concordat sent archivists everywhere. They were supposed to be untouchable, neutral parties, protected by 17 different interplanetary accords. This protection had functioned beautifully for 2 centuries. Then an archivist named Drell had discovered something in the lineage records that certain Vekthari clan leaders would pay any price to suppress, and Drell had passed those records to Kara before disappearing, and now Kara was running through the ruins of a transit station with a human she'd never met, carrying knowledge in her head that could rewrite the political structure of an entire sector, being hunted by people with no interest in the niceties of interplanetary accords. Wade didn't know any of this yet. He was, she would learn, a salvage surveyor, technically independent, technically licensed, technically operating within the boundaries of his permit on Zirion 7, though the Vekthari military presence in the area was well outside the parameters he'd expected when he'd landed 2 days ago. He'd been mapping a collapsed transit hub for salvageable materials when he'd spotted the scanner pulses through his equipment, and, because he was apparently a man constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, had decided to investigate rather than retreat. This was not a quality she had any framework for understanding. Servovari logic was elegant and self-preserving. You did not insert yourself into danger that wasn't yours. You assessed, you documented, you withdrew. You survived by being useful and unobtrusive, and never, never by doing something as spectacularly irrational as climbing toward the source of a Vecthari military scanner sweep to see what was making it go. She filed this contradiction under things she did not have time to think about. They moved for 20 minutes through the ruins, Wade navigating by a handheld scanner that he kept tilted away from her. She noticed this, before he stopped at the edge of a half-collapsed loading bay and crouched against a support column and looked at her properly for the first time. He had a face that was difficult to read by Servavari standards, too mobile, too expressive, every thought visible in the muscles around his eyes and mouth. Her people kept their faces still. It was considered a form of respect, this stillness. She had always found human faces slightly overwhelming, like standing too close to a screen with the brightness turned all the way up. "You want to tell me what that was about?" he said. She considered lying. Then she considered that he had just pulled her out of rubble at personal risk, and apparently with no expectation of reward, and that this made him either extraordinarily dangerous or extraordinarily trustworthy, and that in the absence of better data, she would have to choose one of those interpretations and act on it. "I am a Servavari archivist," she said. "I carry records that certain parties wish destroyed." He nodded, like this made complete sense. "Records about what?" "Lineage falsification, illegal clan mergers, the suppression of succession rights for approximately 900,000 Vectari citizens who don't know they have them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "So you've got proof that someone cheated on an inheritance test on a planetary scale?" She blinked. "That is a significant simplification, but not wrong." She found, to her considerable irritation, that it was not wrong. Wade leaned back against the column and looked at the ceiling and said, very quietly, "My ship's 3 kilometers northeast. I've got enough fuel to reach the Marani relay station at Excellion." He paused. "I'm just thinking out loud here, not making any promises." She did not understand why he was saying this. She said so. He looked back at her with that transparent, unguarded face and said, "Because I'm trying to give you an option without making it weird. You don't know me. You don't have to trust me. But if you need somewhere to go, I've got somewhere to go." She did not have a category for this either. Something is wrong with him, she thought. Normal beings do not behave this way. She said, "I accept your offer," and did not examine too closely the feeling in her chest that she had no name for, because the Vectari were still out there, and she would need her attention elsewhere. She almost lost him at the edge of the loading bay. A scanner sweep came through faster than either of them expected, and Wade grabbed her wrist and pulled her back, and they ended up pressed together behind a fractured wall panel, his arm around her shoulders, and she went absolutely rigid, because in Servavari culture, physical contact without explicit consent was a form of aggression. She understood, on a rational level, that he was shielding her. Her body did not care about the rational level. She was vibrating with something between fight and flight and profound cultural offense, and when the sweep passed and he released her, she stepped back 3 full paces and held up her hand, palm flat outward. He froze. "Did I hurt you? I'm sorry, You did not hurt me." She kept her palm up. "This gesture means I require a moment." He waited. He gave her the moment. He did not speak, did not reach for her, did not explain or apologize further. He simply waited, which was, she noted, exactly the correct thing to do, and she did not know how he'd known that. And this, more than anything else so far, was the thing that made her look at him differently. They reached his ship, a battered hauler called the Grey Wing Prospect, which smelled of machine oil and something she would later identify as instant coffee, without further incident. He gave her a space to herself in the cargo hold, cleared of equipment crates. With a thermal blanket and a ration pack he demonstrated how to open so she wouldn't have to ask. She watched him set it down and step back and not look at her, giving her space as a deliberate act, and she thought of Drell, who had trusted her with everything, and who was probably dead, and she pressed the thought down hard because she could not afford it right now. She slept for 3 hours. When she woke, he had coffee and a second ration pack waiting outside the cargo hold door. He had not opened the door. He had left it there and retreated to the cockpit. She stood holding the ration pack for a long time, trying to construct an interpretation in which this gesture was calculated, trying to find the angle, the leverage he was building, the favor he was setting up to call in. She could not construct it. In 11 years of navigating some of the most politically complex environments in the sector, she had learned to see the architecture of manipulation the way other beings saw furniture. It was just part of every room. And Wade's coffee and ration pack sat outside a closed door with no architecture at all. just a thing he had done because she might be hungry. The simplicity of it cracked something in her that nothing else had reached. She had grown up in the Concordat's archive towers on her homeworld of Thistle, a child marked early as exceptional. Pattern memory, linguistic absorption, the particular quality of attention that makes a great archivist. And she had been educated into neutrality as deliberately as other children are educated into belonging. She had been taught that connection was a liability, that attachment compromised the record, that an archivist who loved too easily would eventually love the wrong thing and distort the truth to protect it. She believed this. She had organized her entire life around it. She had been engaged once to a fellow archivist named Silly, and she had broken that engagement herself, methodically, because she had seen in herself the beginning of the kind of love that rewrites rooms. She had done it cleanly and correctly, and she had filed the decision in the same careful archive where she filed everything, and she had never once let herself wonder what she had given up, because wondering was the beginning of distortion. She drank the coffee. It was terrible. She went to the cockpit. Wade was running course calculations, and he looked up when she came in, and she said, "The coffee is objectively poor." He grinned, wide, sudden, unguarded, and said, "I know. I've been meaning to replace the filtration unit for 6 months. You get used to it." Then, as if realizing she might not get used to it because she was an alien with entirely different taste biology, he added, "Or maybe you won't. Sorry, I don't actually know what Servavari taste sensors are like." "We have 7, she said, sitting in the co-pilot chair without being invited, then wondering if she should have asked. She looked at him to check. He seemed pleased. "Humans have 4 or 5, I believe." "5, officially, though there's debate about fat." He tilted his head. "7. So everything tastes more complicated?" "Everything tastes more complete," she said, and did not understand why the distinction felt important to her until several hours later. She told him about Drell on the second hour of the journey. She had not planned to. She was explaining the lineage records, the specific falsification, the cascade of succession claims it would unlock, and she mentioned Drell's name, and her voice did something unexpected. A slight thinning, a breath taken too carefully, and Wade heard it, and he said quietly, "Was Drell a friend?" She said, "Archivists do not," and stopped. She started again. "Drell was the closest thing to a friend that my professional ethics permitted. That's a painful way to live." She looked at him. "It is the correct way to live. Those aren't always the same thing." She did not answer, because she did not have an answer that she trusted. Wade left her alone with that until the Ixelian relay beacon appeared on the scanner, and then everything went wrong simultaneously, which is almost always how it goes. 3 Vecthari intercept cruisers dropped out of FTL less than 60 kilometers from their position, and the lead ship broadcast a detention order on all frequencies. And Wade said a word she didn't have in her vocabulary but understood from his tone, and then he said, very calmly, "We're not going to outrun them." She knew he was right. She also knew, with the certainty of an archivist who had spent 11 years memorizing clan structures, that the cruiser markings on those ships belonged to the Urel Compact, not the main Vecthari military, but a specific clan-backed enforcement arm, private. Technically illegal under the same 17 Accords that were supposed to protect her, and operating openly in front of a relay beacon that would record everything, which meant they were not being careful anymore, which meant they were not planning to leave witnesses. She stood up from the co-pilot chair, and she was moving toward the back of the ship before she consciously decided to move, because she had remembered something, an image from the Grey Wing's cargo manifest she'd scanned during her 3 hours in the hold, force of habit, archivist's eye cataloging everything, and she was very much hoping she had read it correctly. She had. In a locked case in the rear equipment locker, half buried under salvage gear and a spare thruster coil, was a Vectari resonance blade, a weapon of crystallized sonic frequency, the kind that has no manufacturer's mark because it is grown rather than built, the kind that takes 7 years to produce from the vocal frequencies of a specific clan's elders, the kind that is so sacred and so legally restricted that simply possessing one outside the clan that grew it constitutes an act of war. Wade had salvaged it. He had no idea what it was. She brought it to the cockpit. He turned and saw it, and his face did the thing faces do when the brightness is turned all the way up, every circuit visible. "That's from the 3rd excavation level. I haven't cataloged it yet. What?" "This is a Urel compact resonance blade," she said. "It carries the grown frequency signature of the Urel elders themselves. Possessing it outside the clan is illegal. Broadcasting its frequency on a beacon channel would constitute a formal accusation of theft, abandonment, or betrayal of clan property. She met his eyes. It is also the only thing those ships will stop to respond to, because ignoring a clan blade's broadcast is the single greatest dishonor in Vecthari culture. Wade stared at her for 3 seconds. Then, if I broadcast it, they'll have to deal with the blade situation before they deal with us. They will be legally and culturally obligated to. The beacon will record the broadcast. It becomes evidence. They cannot intercept us while a clan honor dispute is on open record. It would be visible to every ship in this sector. Will it stop them permanently? No, but it will stop them long enough. He looked at the blade. He looked at her. He said, "What happens to whoever's holding it when the broadcast goes out?" She hesitated. By Vectari law, the holder of a broadcasting clan blade in disputed circumstances is presumed to be invoking clan claim. Meaning what? Meaning, she said carefully, that the Urel Compact would be required to treat you as a clan claimant, which is a diplomatic category, which carries protections. She paused. And responsibilities. He was quiet for a beat. Tell me the worst case version of the responsibilities. She said, clan claimants who survive a formal dispute are sometimes recognized as clan arbiters by the Council of Voices, depending on the circumstances. Clan arbiters. The closest translation to your culture's terminology would be... She stopped. Would be what, Kara? She had not told him her name. He had not asked. And yet he said it the right way. 2 syllables, the stress on the second, the way her mother had said it, the way Drell had said it on the day they met, with the kind of ease that means a name has been held carefully before it is spoken. She looked at him, and something in her chest performed an action it was not supposed to perform, something with weight and warmth, and she said very quietly, the closest translation would be king. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, okay, and took the blade from her hands, and walked to the communications panel, and broadcast its frequency on every open channel the relay beacon could carry, and the ship stopped. He had not asked for reassurance. He had not bargained or calculated. He had simply heard what needed doing and done it, the way he dropped a distraction into a ruin and grabbed her arm and left coffee outside a closed door, with that same infuriating, inexplicable instinct for other people's needs that she had no framework for and no defense against. The Urel ships held their position. The beacon logged the broadcast. Within 6 minutes, the Council of Voices had been automatically notified of a clan blade dispute in progress, and within 10, 3 neutral observer ships were already rerouting to their position. Standard protocol, ancient and inviolable, the kind of institutional response that even private enforcement arms couldn't override without catastrophic political consequences. The Urel cruisers withdrew. Wade sat down on the cockpit floor, which was not a chair, and put his face in his hands, and she heard something that she recognized from her xenobiological training as laughter, though it was edged with something more complicated than simple amusement. He laughed until the edge went out of it, and what was left was just sound, just release, just the body doing what bodies do when they've been holding something very heavy for a long time and are finally allowed to put it down. She sat beside him on the floor, not close, but beside him. She said, I should clarify that the clan arbiter designation is not binding until formally ratified by the council, and that ratification requires your consent, and that you can refuse it entirely without... Kara, he said, and his voice was still warm with the remnant of that laughter. Yes. Moment. She pressed her palm flat. She gave him the moment. When he looked up, his face was still too bright, too readable, but she found that she had stopped wanting to look away from it. She had spent 11 years learning to be a still surface. A lake at dawn, she'd once heard a poet describe the ideal archivist, reflection without ripple. And she had been good at it, had been perhaps the best in her generation at it. And she understood now, sitting on the floor of a battered salvage hauler somewhere in the Exilian corridor, with a man who'd accidentally claimed kingship of a Vectari clan on her behalf, that the lake at dawn was not an ideal. It was a loss. It was what water looked like when nothing loved it enough to move. She said, Drell used to tell me that the records we keep are only worth keeping if they're kept by someone who understands why they matter. I thought he was being sentimental. And now? Now I think he was describing something I hadn't experienced yet. Wade looked at her for a long time. Then he said, the coffee really is terrible. She said, it is genuinely among the worst things I've tasted with 7 sensors. He said, I'll fix the filtration unit. It was such a small promise. It was about nothing. It was about machinery and flavor and the mundane maintenance of a lived-in ship. She knew, with the certainty she usually reserved for lineage records and treaty clauses and the deep grammar of civilization that her people had spent millennia learning to read, that he would keep it. Not because he was making a grand gesture, because he was a man who paid attention to what mattered to the person in front of him, and then, quietly and without announcement, did something about it. The observer ships arrived 40 minutes later. The formal proceedings would take weeks. The clan blade dispute, the lineage records she carried, the question of Wade's entirely accidental diplomatic status, all of it moving through channels that had not been designed with this particular set of facts in mind. There would be complications. There would be people on both sides who were unhappy. There would be days that felt like standing under rubble in the dark with a filtration tube and a signal dampener and nothing else. She had already decided she would face those days differently than she had faced the others. Not without fear. Not without the careful, practiced neutrality that had kept her alive and useful and whole. But without that particular loneliness that comes from having organized your life against the possibility of being moved. Wade fixed the filtration unit on the way to the relay station. The coffee was still not good, but it was better, and she drank it sitting in the co-pilot chair that she had started to think of, quietly and without announcement, as hers. And she watched the stars move past the viewport, and she thought about what it meant that the first crack in a thing that has held for 11 years doesn't feel like breaking. It feels, impossibly, like breathing. The blade sat in its case in the cargo hold, humming on frequencies too low to hear. The voice of elders, the sound of lineage, the particular music that holds a people's past together. And she thought, we are all, in the end, just records kept by those who understand why we matter. Some of us simply have to travel very far and get pulled out of rubble by someone with coffee and no filtration unit before we learn who is keeping us.